Hello, and welcome back to the Let Me Add to That podcast. My name is Elizabeth Graswich, Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We are the largest regional education agency in the United States. We serve 80 school districts and nearly 2 million children. We are excited to use this platform to take a deep dive into the conversations surrounding our students and schools in LA County. Welcome back. We are excited to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, which begins each year on September 15th. During Hispanic Heritage Month, we celebrate the histories, culture, and contributions of community members whose ancestors came from Spain, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. If you don't know, the celebration begins in the middle rather than the start of September because it coincides with National Independence Days in various Latin American countries: Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. All celebrate on September 15th, followed by Mexico on September 16th, Chile on September 18th, and Belize on September 21st. I am excited today to be joined by two of our Latina LACOE leaders who throughout their careers have advocated for people of color and underserved populations. Welcome, Los Angeles County Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Debra Duardo.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And we are joined today by LACOE General Counsel Vibiana Andrade. Welcome, Vibiana.
Good morning.
Good morning. Dr. Duardo, we'll start with you. Can you share briefly a little bit about your family's history in relation to Hispanic heritage and Los Angeles?
You know, it's funny. I never, growing up thought about Hispanic Heritage Month. I don't even know if it existed when I was growing up or when we began, talking about Hispanic Heritage Month and celebrating. I never identified as someone Hispanic. I identified as Chicana. So it was a different term for me. But I was always excited to think about honoring and celebrating my culture, my language, the people that I spend so much time with and how I grew up and sharing that with others.
Vibiana, can you share a little bit about your experience growing up in a family that was multi-generational but still very much embedded in the Latino culture?
So my life was touched by immigrants, but it was not the life of an immigrant. The sense that we grew up here, we were born here, we attended the schools. We had, in much the same way, a close family, relations with multi-generations within the family. Your grandparents played an important role. Aunts and uncles and cousins all played important roles, as any culture that's very family based. But we grew up essentially speaking English in an English dominant culture. My family spoke Spanish. My grandmother spoke Spanish, and she spoke to us in Spanish. And I will tell you that I generally tended to answer her in English. And she spoke enough English to understand. And like multi-generational families, language becomes really, really fluid in that way, where you can answer and speak and communicate with one another. One story of language for us was that I think I understood language better than my siblings, or better than some of my siblings and cousins. And when the family would gather in the kitchen and they would have, conversations about things that were perhaps more interesting and private and personal, they would speak in Spanish so that the kids wouldn't understand. And of course I would sort of wander by and pick up on what the secret was and then come back and tell the other kids about what the secret was. And in that way, language becomes sort of the dominant language, or the mother tongue becomes the language of secrets, or the language of stories that they want to tell, separate from their kids.
I love that story because I think there's so many of our listeners who in different ways and different languages can probably relate. Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Duardo, your parents hail from Mexico. Can you share some of your memories or traditions from your childhood that reflect your heritage?
Yeah, I think a big part of my heritage is family and a real value placed on family. My father was the first of his siblings to come from Mexico, and a lot of family members coming from Mexico would stay with us, so a huge extended family. But it's also the language, speaking Spanish, the food that we eat, the celebrations, the music. I still today, when I'm cleaning, I put mariachi music on. It's just what I was used to growing up. Going to quinceañeras and weddings and things like El Día de los Muertos, that are things that not everybody was familiar with, was something that was really meaningful to me, and something that it brings me so much joy and pleasure.
You remind me of the mariachi festival that happens at Hollywood Bowl, which I really want to go to this coming year. And I know it's something that you go to regularly.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's always, when you hear mariachi music, for those of us who grew up listening to mariachi music, it's just a part of your soul and who you are, and brings back so many memories of our parents and grandparents. And it's wonderful that we celebrate that.
And Vibiana, one of the things that's so cool about Los Angeles and Los Angeles community is there's so many people with different stories and different experiences. Your family is actually multi-generational, Angelino. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in growing up and the interplay with the culture?
Sure. Happy to do that. Our experience was different. Not a typical immigrant experience in the sense that, like some Latinos, the border crossed us and we didn't cross the border. In other words, many of us were born in the United States. My grandparents were born in the United States, and they go back, multi-generations. Long before the United States was the United States, territory of Arizona. I have grandparents from both sides who hailed from there, as well as the northern part of Mexico. So that made our experience different in that it wasn't necessarily an immigrant experience. We were born here. We were always here. Did it change the language? Yeah, and sort of interestingly, I grew up speaking Spanish. I grew up around family in much the same way. Family always was very important. Grandparents were around. They all spoke Spanish. And we grew up speaking Spanish. Slightly different story with the kids that follow, the generations that follow, but the same traditions, the same sorts of food, the same music, the same love of art, and the same history, the love of history, the love of music. I think those things didn't change.
That's beautiful. And, one of the things that I think creates a lot of confusion for people is there's so many different terms used. We're using the term Hispanic heritage because that's what the month is called. However, you also hear the term Latinx, Latino, Latina, Chicana, Mexican Americans. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about those different terms and also kind of how they sit with the community?
So that's an interesting question, largely because the community isn't monolithic. It is widely diverse in its beliefs, I think, in its systems of belief. But the word Hispanic came from the federal government when they were looking for a term, and it was a term that they adopted and gave to us. And gave this to us and put it on us. And there are many Latinos or Chicanos who take offense at the term. They don't like that term because it was imposed by the government on people, rather than it being a term that you choose to use that reflects who you are. the word I use is Chicana because that's who I am, but that is uniquely Mexican American or Mexican in its derivation.
Yeah, and I think depending on your age, depending on, what part of Latin America you come from, people have different terms that they feel comfortable with. And I think it's very individual and, people should feel comfortable with whatever and however they identify. I can see how it could create some challenges for people who aren't Latino or Chicano. It's like, oh, I don't want to offend anybody. What should I call them? And I think the best thing is to check in with the person. How do you identify? Are you a Chicana? Are you a Latina? Are you someone Hispanic? And that's probably the safest way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And to your point, it isn't something that you can apply to all the community. It's a very diverse community with diverse approaches and experiences. And so, and it's like anything, right? Labeling or creating a term.
Well, I think there's also the sense that because we don't live in a society that's necessarily non-discriminatory, like that's the goal, right? But the community isn't necessarily that, and so you get lumped in, and some people are treated as though they're Mexican, and they can be Salvadoran, or they can be Venezuelan, or they can be a whole bunch of other things, and they may take offense at being treated that way. And in a society where there's systemic discrimination, nobody's asking that question, right? They're simply being treated a certain way in a disfavored way.
It's such a good segue because while you have the title General Counsel here at LACOE, you actually have a very long history of being an advocate. And I know Dr. Duardo had shared with me some of your background. And Dr. Duardo, you may want to ask her a little bit about that background.
Yeah, when I got to LACOE and got to know Vibiana Andrade, I was just blown away with her background, with her experience, with her brilliance. And I just wanted the whole world to know, like, we have this amazing woman who has had such a huge impact on Los Angeles, on our community, on the law and how it impacts everyone, but especially Latinos. So when I found out about the role that she played around Prop 187, I was like, does everybody know this? So I would love for Vibiana to share a little bit about her work and her background with the movement that impacted Prop 187.
So I was working at, this is now such a long time ago, but I was working at MALDEF as the counsel there.
And do you mind explaining what MALDEF is for our listeners?
Sure. It's a Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And it was the premier Latino law firm in Los Angeles. And more than that, it's really a civil rights organization. And at the time I was working there and very deeply involved in immigration matters and in immigration issues, an area of law that I've taken a great interest in for a lot of reasons. But certainly at that time, Proposition 187 was created, and it was being used as a political tool, essentially to prop up the political career of a pretty unpopular governor who was really seeking to create a buzz and to create to scapegoat people. And the immigrants were at the brunt of this, and so the proposition itself would have taken away education. It would have taken away virtually all of the social services that immigrants and immigrant families and even families that were citizen children of immigrants would have been affected by this horrible proposition. So there was a political campaign and a lot of organizing that went around that, as well as the legal strategy. And so as a lawyer, I was really excited to be in court, to be working on the matters, and to be working really closely with the community. For me, because of my love of that community and the fact that this was such a, it was at that time like the the thing that we all lived in and breathed in and fought against. And it was really an amazing fight. But it began first, I think, in the organizing that was done, in the political campaigns that were put together. And the media was really involved with it. The Spanish language media, the Spanish language print media. People were really intensely involved and interested in the politics that were at play, and the fact that a whole community was being painted with this terrible brush in such an evil way. So in the court, it was really, it's like the exciting moments when you're working with folks and figuring out how best to present the case. We lost the election, and the very next day we were in court, stopping it from taking effect. And there was a restraining order that was granted by Judge Byrne, Matt Byrne, in the federal court. The case was then assigned to Judge Mariana Falzer. And she was this wonderfully courageous federal jurist who stopped the proposition. Most of it never went into effect. Some minor provisions did. And over a period of several years, because then the whole legal process took several years, it was finally stopped and then negotiated when the governor changed. And there were also changes in the federal laws that sort of took over what Proposition 187 had tried to do, and it created federal rules. That was the basic legal argument that underscored most of this. Had to do with what happens when a state decides it wants to be the immigration agency rather than the federal role that the federal government plays. You can see some of that being played out now with Texas and some of the other places that are the other events that are occurring in across the country now.
The first time I saw your name linked to Prop 187 was in an old Los Angeles Times article, and that article actually featured your mom. And I went, wow, this goes deep, and this advocacy comes from your mom. So your mom was also an advocate.
Yeah, she was. I think so. She had this really basic sense of right and wrong, and what was wrong about this, and just a real keen sense of that. Not because she was a lawyer. She wasn't. By trade, she was a nurse. She was from a small mining town in Arizona, a copper mining town, and was just really fierce. She was a fierce advocate for her community in many ways, and she grew up in a place that, that was very segregated, that was very where the Mexicans were the laborers in the mine, and the white folks were the ones that controlled and ran the stores and were in charge of the mine.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And there's so many beautiful stories out there of people who, like you said, they maybe weren't lawyers, they maybe weren't in a courtroom, they maybe weren't politicians, but they affected change through their advocacy.
I think it was the people on the streets. And to now look at what's happened in the aftermath of all of that, like in the past 25 years, the immigrant advocates have become much more astute and much more vocal and much more present in ways that when I was deeply involved in it, it was different. We spent a lot of time trying to protect undocumented immigrants so that they weren't victimized multiple times by their involvement in this kind of movement. Now, with kids that are involved in DACA and other sorts of immigrant programs, they're front and center, and they are the face of a different movement, which is, I think, testimony to the world having gotten better, to people being more accepting in some small measure.
Which really, and actually, if I can ask this question of both of you, how have you seen things evolved over your careers? Have things improved?
Well, I would definitely say that I've seen improvement. I mean, just the fact that now, we have, I think California is the first state to have ethnic studies as part of our graduation requirements coming up, that we really, as part of the standards, really focus on making sure that instruction is culturally relevant. I mean, there are changes in ed code and policy that assure that there is more integration and more celebration and seeing curriculum that is more inclusive. However, when you look at outcomes, it's disappointing to still see that disparity between, Latino students and their white and Asian peers, and also for African American students. You see these disparities that that have existed for a very long time. Whether you call it an achievement gap or an opportunity gap, we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that there is more equity and that all students have access to quality instruction that gets them over that finish line. They graduate and go on to college and thrive. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think that we have made significant progress over the years.
And I remember, Dr. Duardo, hearing you talk in front of an ethnic studies training and sharing with that group that when you were growing up, you didn't hear the stories of people that looked like you or came from the same background of you, and how important it was for you to see that change happen.
Yeah, I mean, even in terms of who the leaders are, who are the heroes, who are the scientists, who are the authors, who are the people that we celebrate and learn and read about. I mean, I remember for me growing up, I'd hear people say, "Oh, it's Cheech and Chong," or what did they celebrate about our culture, or was it Cinco de Mayo that everybody thought was Mexican Independence Day, and you'd have to say, "No, that's not Mexican Independence Day." So people pick and choose the parts of the culture they want to enjoy and celebrate. And I think it's really important that people understand all of the culture and all of who we are and what we bring to the table and the contributions. And that should certainly be included in our educational system, where all children have the access to learn about people that are different from them, whether they're Black, Latino, Asian, people with disabilities, people that are gay or transgender, that those things should be open, and we should learn about the people from those communities and the contributions they made.
Well, and I think that the flip side of that, at least for me, in college, it's the first time I really came to understand what the history was, and the fact that there were, people rounded up during the Great Depression and deported from the streets of Los Angeles because they were the face of poverty in LA. And I never knew that. That's not a history that we learned in high school. It's not until I get to college that I began seeing those things and understanding those things about the unique history. It's now in the history books, and it will be part of what is studied in ethnic studies. And I think that's absolutely critical. It's like learn the truth about what it is that's happened in our society at all its different levels, at all its and understand how to be analytical about what that history has done and what it means.
And I think, I've had the same experience, just going to, a museum and reading more about the history. I had no idea about much of what had happened during the 20th century. And, and then speaking to colleagues and finding out that their families were impacted by some of the horrible things that happened here in California to people whose families came from Mexico, but they may not have immigrated. They may have been multi-generational, but it still impacted some of the decisions that were made that negatively impacted them. When you look at the education landscape, we talked a little bit about ethnic studies and access. And how are there other ways that you see it evolving to support a more diverse culture and climate for our kids?
I think it's promising. I think there's an awareness and the will to improve. Like I said, just the fact that ethnic studies is a part of the graduation requirement throughout the state says a lot about how we feel about being more inclusive and making sure that children have true history and that they learn about some of the things that we didn't have the opportunity to learn about growing up. I think we've come a long way since, the 1968 walkouts. I think there's a lot of improvement, and it's exciting. And I think that, the more we continue to advocate for inclusivity and making sure that all children can thrive and be excited about whatever their culture and heritage is important.
And that, one of the things that LACOE does that people may not be aware of, and Vibiana, you run the Immigrant Relations Department, and there's support for making sure that children that come to our country are able to get into the educational system and then have all the supports that they need, and the families, right? It's not just the kids. Do you mind talking a little bit about that work?
Right. Sure. It's recognizing inclusivity at its very basic level. In recognizing that that families need access to multiple levels of support. We work very closely with Los Angeles County in making sure that families understand what access to services they can, that they have access to. Now, most recently, healthcare became much more accessible to immigrants at lots of different levels, and recognizing that there are these multiple programs for food, programs for refugees, that specifically language-related programs, lots and lots of supports that are provided, and that schools are being asked to provide, because we recognize that these are inclusive communities.
And if I could just add to that, Liz, I think the other thing that's really important, and Vibiana and her team have done an amazing job on this, it's educating parents and getting accurate information out there. There's a lot of myths around public charge. If I take public assistance for food or for certain services that I need for my children, does that mean that if I'm trying to receive legal documents to stay in this country, that it's going to have an impact? Or just so much misinformation that's been out there that a lot of times it's so important that we educate not only our school community and our educators and teachers, but parents themselves and students themselves, and empower them so that they understand what their rights are and what they have access to and how we can support them.
So let me add to that. It's really important for families and for parents to understand and to feel comfortable coming to a school and advocating for their children, whether it's asking for special services for their children or asking that their child be challenged in different ways and enriched in different ways. And often we face cultural barriers, not just language, but also sort of the sense of humility that people may have, not feeling comfortable. There's a sense within many Latinos that hold teachers and schools in such high esteem that it becomes really difficult for them to say that they have a place to advocate for their son or daughter. And it's really important that schools recognize that and try to create ways of listening and ways of accepting that kind of feedback and those sorts of requests from parents.
And while we're talking about Hispanic heritage, and there's been some high-profile situations that we've helped, right? When we had a number of kids, unfortunately, come to Los Angeles, they were placed in facilities, and we helped support them. But we're supporting kids from all different cultures, right? We have a lot of families coming here from different places that need a lot of support, and your staff is doing that.
Absolutely. There have been different groups from different cultures that have found their way to Los Angeles and found their way to their new home from all over the world. And most recently from the Ukraine and from Venezuela and from other countries that have been adversely affected by either the wars or other forms of political upheaval and economic upheaval, and recognizing that and recognizing that there are our country has always played a role as the welcomer of asylees. Now, having said that, there have been lots of times when we haven't been really welcoming, but at different times, I think at this point there are programs that are set aside for refugees. And for us, it's really important that kids and that school districts understand what it is that they need to ask when a family arrives and a family is looking to register their children.
And ultimately, it's contributing to the rich diversity and the beauty of Los Angeles and Los Angeles culture.
Yeah, and schools play such a significant role in assisting families, refugees or families that are coming under, difficult circumstances. First thing you want to do is provide some normalcy in their lives, and getting their kids back in school with resources and services and support and learning again makes a huge difference. And our schools becoming welcoming places that have special programs that help families who may not speak the language or understand the educational system here, how to register. There's a lot of things you need. You need to be vaccinated. You need to have proof of, where you live and the boundaries of the school district. So I think it's really important that many of our districts have created a welcoming environment to help those families enroll their children so that they can get into school as quickly as possible.
What advice would you give to younger Latino generations looking to become leaders?
I think live your passion. I think that fundamentally is the most important advice to give anybody, to dream and to live your passion, to kick down the doors and do away with obstacles. The one piece I would also advise is that our community really needs to be vigilant, remain vigilant, because at this point we're watching a Supreme Court undo lots and lots of decisions that have been made and that have created rights in the past, notably affirmative action and the actions that the decision that was recently taken by the Supreme Court and the response to that and the way in which we need to remain vigilant so that even if you remove what was known as affirmative action, it's not welcoming the opposite, which is to discriminate. Right? That's not the invitation to discriminate. And so it's really important for people to remain vigilant and to remain vigilant of our rights and our liberties.
I would add to just for every child to be themselves, to bring that joy of who they are, their culture, everything about them, to celebrate that, to not be ashamed of being different, but that's something to really celebrate. I know when I was growing up, I was really embarrassed because my dad had such a heavy accent and nobody could, and I would tell him, don't talk when you're around my friends or at school. But really getting our youth to understand there's this beauty and this strength and this uniqueness in who each of us are, not only our culture, but who we are individually, and to celebrate that and to, be curious and to ask more about your culture and the cultures of others, because it's a beautiful experience to learn more about who we all are and how we can coexist.
And as we close, despite the challenges that have been faced by many people in our country and in our state, what gives you hope for the future?
I have a lot of hope. I mean, I think that just working with like our students and our student advisory board, we have intelligent youth that are wanting to take action and are wanting to be empowered to make changes that they want to see. And the more I work with our youth, and it's the youth that gives me hope that, they're going to be able to figure things out. They're going to problem solve. They're going to take us to the next level of ensuring inclusivity, because to them, when you talk to youth, this is one of the top things that they really care about. They care about equality and inclusivity, not just of races and ethnicity, but around gender, around many, many other issues that they are really passionate about. So for me, it's always what gives me the most hope is being around our youth and seeing the potential that they have to make our world and our future better.
That was a great conversation. Thank you both for joining us today. And if you want to know more about Hispanic Heritage Month, please check out our website, www.lacoe.edu, and please follow us on social media.
Please follow the Los Angeles County Office of Education on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Los Angeles COE. That's Los Angeles COE. Or you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Los Angeles County Office of Education.